Good morning. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing our conversations about living in the light. Let's start with a prayer, my friends. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master, Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, dearest friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Bless us that we may feel your presence within, and that your wisdom permeate our minds and our hearts and our feelings. Guide us that we not only understand, but are able to follow through on that understanding, to act according to our highest wisdom, to move through this world in constant attunement with your inner guidance. Om. Peace. Amen. For a couple of days now, we've been talking about the subject of how to work with your emotions. I think I said yesterday, it's really much too big a subject for these morning conversations, and more is required than I can really offer you. I rightly received an email after my first class that said, in essence, yeah, but what do you do about it? Which I completely respect, because what good does it do you to have it all worked out if we're still just swept away by the ocean tides? And yesterday I issued a disclaimer, which I will reissue today. Even if you listen very carefully and memorize every word I say for these 3 classes, it's going to be a long road, because the inclination to be swept up by the vrittis in our chakras that are persuaded, that have committed themselves to a belief that certain responses are essential for our well-being. That's not an easy paradigm to dismantle. And part of the only thing I can suggest in a cycle this large is relax, exhale, look at the long rhythm, and know that there's nothing wrong with you. I mean, there's a lot wrong with you. There's a lot wrong with me. Compared to God realization, we're just completely out to lunch. That is a fact. But the process that we're following to get back to center is the only possible access route. And part of what happens when we are emotional in our responses is we become emotional about being emotional, which is, we're caught. This is who we are. A lot of the secret, the understanding of how this works, is really about the chakras. Every time we act or think or feel anything at all, we are expressing energy at a certain vibration of magnetism related to what we deeply believe is the truth about life. Now, we exist on many levels simultaneously. That's why we have chakras from the base of the spine to the crown to the spiritual eye. And all of those chakras represent different vibrations of consciousness. I'm summarizing what is also a very long subject and much too big for these conversations. But every time we repeat an action, every time we do anything, period, even as the Gita puts it, even if we restrain action and try not to get karma by restraining action and performing no action, that act of restraining action is an action. And every time we do that, a certain amount of energy is registered in the chakras. The chakras end up being this interrelated pattern of energy, pulling our consciousness into these vortexes that we have created. And through our many incarnations, as we travel the soul's long journey from first expression from God, from a completely materialistic sense of reality to self-realization, we build up these energy patterns, and energy is not passive, it creates a vortex. So whenever we sort of have a life of an element of life force go through us, all of these chakras compete to define it, to paint it, to give it a color. You know, we see something. We see this started with an inquiry from a mother of young children. We see our young child having done something. You know, young children are magnificent for bringing out of us every single aberration there is. I've never raised children myself, but of course, in the community, you know many children and many parents of children. I remember visiting with some friends of mine. They had two young boys at that time. We were just chatting in the living room, and then we all became aware that it had been some time since we'd seen the boys, and that there was a kind of ominous quiet around the whole house. And so one of the guests volunteered and disappeared and found the boys in the kitchen, did not return for some period of time. And he came back, he let us know that the boys had been cooking. Cooking consisted of pulling many ingredients out of the shelf, pouring them onto the table and mixing them up. You know, this is what children do. And I think they had a vague sense that what they were doing might not have been quite acceptable because they're very silent in it, and looked a little caught out when my friend walked into the kitchen. But children do things all the time that we have a perception. We see our children having dumped flour and water and peanuts and cereal and milk onto the table, and we've just perceived it at that point. There's an energy that is perceiving. And then all the vortices, the vrittis in our spine compete to be the window through which that life force is expressed. And if the habit of beginning to scream and becoming quite alarmed at what the child has done has been repeated multiple times, not just in this lifetime, but in other lifetimes, the magnetism of that vritti is very strong. And so the life force wobbles for a moment, trying to decide what to do, and the different vrittis compete. And whichever one is the strongest will eat your life force, and suddenly that's the window through which you're expressing yourself. But the thing we have to realize is that even though these forces seem very powerful, all we are talking about is energy. This is one of the most important things to understand. None of this is fixed. It is literally just one energy pattern against another energy pattern. Theoretically, the entire pattern could be shifted in an instant if we were able to put out as much energy in that instant as we have accumulated by all our past actions to create the pattern we have now. But the grace of God is the secret weapon that we have in this, because the grace of God is more than sufficient to wipe out all these vrittis and bring us immediately into a totally altered state of consciousness. And the power of the grace of God has to do with bliss. It has to do with joy. What is it about the grace of God that completely takes us away from all our habitual ways of understanding? Everything about human destiny, as Master explained way back in the beginning with his little book, The Science of Religion, which Swami re-expressed in the book, God is for Everyone. Every sentient being is motivated by two realities: to escape suffering and to experience happiness. And the soul's long journey and everything that happens in the world is because individual jivas define suffering and define happiness differently. But even though, as we move from delusion to self-realization, we keep redefining those realities, and different jivas at different stages on that journey have completely different perspectives, there is an objective reality. And that objective reality is the more we are in harmony with our higher nature, the more we are in harmony with God, the less we suffer and the more happiness we experience. Now, when you tell that to someone who hasn't even begun to think about God, they they literally don't hear you. In the Bhagavad Gita, and I'm totally going to paraphrase this, but there's this wonderful verse that basically talks about how we gradually come to an interest in these teachings and then an ability to follow it. And it goes through the stages of us hearing this truth. And the first stage is, well, the first stage is nobody ever talks to you about it. The second stage is they talk to you about it, but you don't even hear their voice while they're talking. It's like they suddenly shift into another language and you have no idea when they're telling you that the desires are the source of all suffering. Overcome your desires, surrender your life to God. We just don't even hear it. The second is you sort of vaguely hear the voice. Now, I may be making this up, but this is what I remember reading in the Gita, that you hear the voice, but you immediately fall asleep. You can't stand it. You just don't want to know it, so you immediately fall asleep. Then you hear it and immediately forget it. Then you hear it and argue with it. Then you hear it and it begins to make sense. Then you embrace it as your own. And what causes that projection to happen, that progression to happen, is experience. It's just, I think this was going to make me happy and it didn't. I mean, a very vivid example is anybody who's ever been caught in some kind of addiction, which is a very common experience in the world that we live in. You know, you start drinking. I say you because this has not been anything in this life that I've had to deal with. But a person starts drinking or taking a drug or smoking marijuana or whatever you're doing because it seems to make you feel better. You know, young men or young women who talk about starting at, 11 or 12, suddenly they're not so socially awkward, suddenly they're not so nervous, suddenly they're not so worried about peer pressure, and they'll just, that's how it begins. But then at a later stage, you find that your life has become a nightmare, that which you thought was going to make you happy is now causing you nothing but suffering. And then you have to reverse all that energy with this tremendous effort to persuade yourself that even though everything in you thinks you would be better off if you took that drink again, that now you know it is not the route to happiness. Now just think about anything, accumulating money, telling people off. How about just giving vent to whatever wild feeling comes through you? Or believing that you did something, I suffer, my suffering is because you did something. Now, Master made this very interesting statement where he said, because we are trapped in the illusion of time and one thing follows another, we imagine that one thing causes another. That's a very hard thing to break. But what's really happening to each one of us is we are living through our necessary karma. So my necessary karma is for me, all karma is for me to find out what actually causes suffering and what brings me happiness. And there is a tipping point that we have to come to, and it can't be rushed. In the Bhagavad Gita, and for the last several days, this verse has kept coming up. Some karma is like smoke over a fire. You just blow on it and it clears. Some karma is like dirt on a mirror. You have to scrub it a little, but you can still get it off. Some karma is like an embryo in the womb, and you just have to wait until it's finished. So there's a tipping point that comes where the pleasure we get from what we now know to be a wrong action, let me phrase it differently, the suffering that comes from what we now know to be a wrong action is greater than the suffering, what we perceive to be the suffering of putting out the energy to change it. You understand that? The reason we don't change is because it's easier to go with what I lovingly call the known misery. Even though it's miserable, it's familiar. And to rouse the energy that's going to be required to retrain ourselves to respond in a different way, for all of us, it's tremendous. And even to have the awareness to catch it before it takes us over. And that tipping point, smoke over a fire, dirt on a mirror, or the embryo in the womb. And all we just have to keep, as Swami says, maintain as much as you can a certain mental detachment from your own actions. Oh my, here we go again. But don't justify it and don't feel guilty about it, either one. Well, if you hadn't spoken to me like that, then I wouldn't have spoken to you like that. Well, actually, it had nothing to do with what he said to you. Or she said to you. All they did was open the door for you to explore your own consciousness. The way I think about it is other people participate in your karma, but they don't cause it. So they're definitely present, and they definitely might be the trigger, but the karma to allow yourself to speak or act or respond in a way that you deeply regret later, because you realize, very simply, it's not a sin. It's nothing. It's just that it was a lack of understanding of where my true happiness comes from. Restraint either feels impossible or terrible. Now, bear in mind, and this is why this is way too much of a subject for these morning classes, and I'm just going to say what I say today and then we'll finish. Suppression is not transcendence. And to suppress something is different than disciplining it. To suppress it is to be ashamed of it, to be afraid of it, to be guilty about it, and just try to expunge it from my world. But it's still there. It's still happening. It's still what I believe is appropriate. I mean, when somebody behaves in an awful way to you and you merely don't speak, but every part of you wants to speak and feels you should speak and feels you're justified in speaking, you've actually gained very little by suppressing it. But if instead someone speaks to you in such a way that you know, for example, is completely inappropriate, but you know also at the same time that if you try to answer, you will become even more inappropriate, then you make a conscious choice. It's not worth it to me. I'm not suppressing it. I'm perfectly capable of saying it. I'm not afraid to say it. I feel I have a perfect right to say it. I just think it would accomplish nothing to say it. And then we've actually seen a higher value. But it's right there. It's just in front of me. This is an option. This is an option. This is an option. Which one do I want? Now, of course, the level of self-control, the level of awareness that is required in the moment to do that, well, that's the soul's long journey. And every spiritual technique that we have, from affirmations to positive thinking to music, whispers from eternity, Kriya Yoga above all, because when we practice Kriya, we're working directly on shifting the vrittis. And because the vrittis are the whole story, that we are an energy pattern, the life force comes into play because of some perception, and then the vrittis compete to be the defining vibration of that life force. So with Kriya, if we get rid of the vrittis, if we create the river of magnetism moving up the spine that gradually runs through all those chakras, and the river of magnetism going to the spiritual eye is stronger than the commitment to this delusion. Because now this is the competing theories of happiness. I will give in to these feelings because I've been giving into them for God knows how many lifetimes. And the effort to not give into them is more painful to me than the effort to give into them. Let me get my thoughts right here. Oh, yes. But what happens when the river increases to the spiritual eye, we have experiences. And we have experiences of happiness, bliss. It gradually becomes happiness, moves to joy, moves to bliss. These are all English words, but we know what we're talking about. There's a progression for the source, the duration, the freedom of that. You can have happiness because circumstances are perfect, but that's not really bliss, because if circumstances change, your happiness changes. Bliss is the nature, the everlasting nature of our own being that is untouched by circumstances. And when we increase the upward moving river of energy in the spine, we get deeper and deeper into an experience of bliss. And the experience of bliss is a vibration. The desire to retaliate when someone says something I don't like is a vibration. And they each have a force of energy. And when you think of a river and a whirlpool, if the river flowing to the sea is stronger than the whirlpool just gets swept up and goes off to the sea. And there's no analysis, there's no conversation, there's no moment of I give it up. It's just the greater force absorbs the lesser. And all forces that take us away from spirituality are lesser. By definition, they're lesser because the only lasting reality is this movement of the Kundalini up the spine to the spiritual eye to liberation. So anything that we do that increases the positive flow of magnetism and gives us a deeper and deeper experience and understanding of what true happiness is, that very action, unbeknownst to us, is eating away at these alternate theories of happiness and gradually reducing the magnetism of these vrittis. This is partly the embryo in the spine, embryo in the womb karma. I mean, certainly in my own life, and I'm sure you've all experienced it if you meditate at all, you just become different. Something will come up that's come up many times before in your life, and you just respond different. You're a different person. And there was no particular point at which I even attacked this as an issue. It's just the vritti that captured my life force and colored it according to itself. That vritti has just gradually been absorbed into the river of higher happiness. And that alternate theory has just gone away. I mean, it happens with our taste in music, with our taste in people, in friendships, with what we consider to be entertaining, our reading material, the movies that we watch. We just find, I used to really like this, but I don't. Just like children sometimes. Swamiji talked about when he went back to Switzerland as a grown person, he saw on the shelf some candy that he had really loved when he was a child. And so he bought it just for old time's sake, just because it was a happy memory to him. He said he took just the smallest bite of it, and it was just appallingly, just unsophisticated, overwhelming sweetness because as a child, partly because of the way his senses were, and also just because he was a child, he loved it. But as a grown man, he'd now had many more experiences where that particular kind of sweetness wasn't even attractive to him anymore. Part of that is maturity, but from childhood to adulthood in normal life, it represents from childhood spiritually to self-realization, where we become a mature person. It just shifts. So what I'm saying about all of this, and we're talking specifically about emotions, but it's true about absolutely anything on the spiritual path, and the points that I've made are very important. Don't worry about your faults, the Master said, and it's very important, we have to say this again, don't worry about your faults. Just try to love God more. And that's not just sentiment. I mean, that sounds so beautiful, and then we insert our complexes and it doesn't make sense to us anymore and we fight against it. That may be true for everyone else, but not for me. Maybe they shouldn't worry about their faults, but I have to worry about mine. We were all amused once by this woman who lived for a time at Ananda and then did not find it congenial. Swamiji was having a lot of satsangs and things at his house at that time, and she had a lot of energy and she seemed very promising in the sense that she might benefit a great deal from what Ananda had to offer. So he often included her in these gatherings. And gradually she started refusing the invitations. And that was because she said, if I spend too much time in Swami Kriyananda's company, I forget my problems and then I'm not working on them. And this falls under the category of missing the point. which Patanjali actually says is one of the dangers on the spiritual path, is missing the point. What was happening to her is the flow of grace and uplifted happiness was simply dissolving those difficulties, but she was at that point where she argued against the truth. She wanted to hold on to them. She thought by concentrating on thinking on them, that's how you get rid of them, but that's not true. Don't worry about your faults. Just think about loving God, because the more you love God, the more you will have experiences of a deeper kind of happiness than any of these vrittis and emotional responses can give us. And then gradually that experience of higher happiness will simply dissolve those vrittis and that inclination will go away. Now, there's one last point before I end on this subject, because I don't think I'm going to come back to it again. I'm going to send you to the class that Shanti's giving now and to all the classes that I have on my YouTube channel. If you're interested in emotions, just write it in and the subjects will come up, and variations on the theme like the positive, how to find happiness. There is a tremendous difference between feeling and emotion. And one of the things that keeps us in emotion is that we think without emotion we can't have feeling. And part of the problem is that the English words are not exact. Feeling is the nature of consciousness. Consciousness itself is a feeling, and that feeling is bliss. What emotion is, and this is how I find that I can think about it powerfully, feeling is the trunk of the tree. And the trunk of the tree is the source of the life force that reaches all the way out to the farthest limb. We have a huge elm in the middle of our community. It's the grandmother tree for the whole place, or the grandfather tree. And its branches go so far into our green courtyard, and it intersects with other tree branches, and you have to follow it and realize, oh, this is all emanating from the same source. And the farthest, tiniest leaf is animated from the trunk of that tree. If the trunk broke, that farthest leaf would also die. But if that leaf were cut off, the trunk remains the same. Feeling is to always be standing and acting from the trunk of the tree, which is to say, from the center of ourselves, from the spine, ideally from the spiritual eye, but from as much from our source as we are able to do. To be conscious of our source, to recognize that my child has poured milk and flour onto the table and I have to do something about it. I'm way over here on the leaf and I have a strong feeling about this. I love my child. I love my kitchen. I want to help my child to understand the right balance in relationship to my kitchen. It's not that I'm not motivated. You see, feeling is what motivates us. Feeling is what connects us to other people. Emotion is when we start living in the leaf, and that everything is about the leaf. How could you treat me like that? How could you talk to me like that? What are those people going to do? This has to be changed. And we can feel it right then. We've taken our reality, we've shrunk it down to this tiny part, and then that leaf breaks off and we fall to the ground. But if we're standing in the trunk and even reaching out and even going through a hurricane force, but still, the power is coming from the center of ourselves. So emotion is tiny compared to feeling. Emotion sometimes looks more intense, looks more wild, but that's just because it's out of control. And by that, I don't mean that control is what we're trying to do, but it's become separated from its source. It's the kite just flailing around in the wind and the string has been cut. But the kite can soar very high. Or if you want to do the submarine, it can go very deep. The diver, but the air cord has to stay there. That's what we're looking for. And that's why someone who's deeply centered in themselves, like Swami Kriyananda, we use as an example, he didn't give in to emotion, but he had a deeper feeling for life, for people, for art, for music, for God. than anybody I ever knew. And he could communicate those feelings to other people and help other people because it wasn't because he didn't feel it. It's that his feeling always emanated from the center and was guided really literally from the spiritual eye instead of being eaten by all these alternate theories of happiness. Attunement to God, that that is the source of everything that we're seeking. So everything that we do that brings us back to that, it solves all other realities. Assume their natural order. Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added unto you. God bless you, my friends.